Now then, when we talk about a spun rod bearing, so let's look at that bearing. Now this is a fairly used but somewhat healthy bearing. And if you look, there's little tangs in here. I say that, it doesn't fit super great. There's little tangs that hold this bearing in place. Now then, when there is a lack of oil, it will cause this bearing to actually spin in here, and that notch is no longer where it needs to be, and it causes pressure between the bearing and the journal, or between the rod and the journal. And so as that bearing spins around like this and gets pressed against this journal, it starts heating up. And the more it heats up, the more friction, the hotter it gets. It eventually gets hot enough that it will weld itself to this journal. Now this particular crank was from a spec Cayman race engine. The gentleman was in his very first race. He was all excited, and sure enough, he had an engine failure, spun rod bearing. You can see this bearing. This is what used to be the bearing. This is what the journal looks like. This is what it looks like with a bearing welded to it. And so once this bearing welds to this crank, it inevitably causes the rod to fail. This is not the fault of the rod. It's not the fault of the rod bolts. It is 100% an issue with the bearing. And then once this rod fails, while the crank is still spinning, it starts beating the heck out of everything. And so you can see this crank carrier, for instance, still has a piece of the rods stuck in it. That's lodged there pretty good. You can see this crank carrier here. The other half of this crank carrier has the side of it completely blown out. We see pieces of cylinder that have been trashed and knocked out. It truly is a catastrophic event that does a lot of damage to the engine. And so that's why understanding the issue and how to correct it is so important for helping these engines stay alive and keep going. This crank is probably capable of 5, 6, I don't know, 800,000 miles. We've seen them with a couple 100,000 miles on them, and they look as good as they did brand new. And so same thing with these carriers. And then even with the cases, once we get done with them, we've talked about some of the things that we need to, the flaws that we need to fix in those, but really the crank carrier and the crank itself are very robust and reliable as long as they're properly oiled. Here's a few more rod bearings off of engines. And we talked last time a little bit about oil analysis and why it's important. And so these are tri-metal bearings, and you can see that on these that are worn down, this one's actually chipped off and is pretty close to spinning. And when it gets down to the copper layer, or that third layer, and starts shedding copper, that's what it looks like when you tear it apart. And that's why we're always mindful if we're seeing high amounts of copper relative to the other metals in an oil analysis. It is really the #1 thing we're looking for on an ongoing basis. If there is copper in there, I'm not saying it's too late, but it definitely warrants max protection on the oil side and taking really good care of the engine to keep it from degrading any further. At least in a street engine, in a race engine, it's probably a good time to rebuild.
So this is the bad guy.
Yes, this is the killer. And so this is essentially when you hear rod knock, it's because the rod bearing has spun, the rod has failed, and is literally beating up the engine every time the crank turns around.
I'm Philip. Thanks for watching. If you want to check out another video, check it out right there.